Turning point. It wasn't until about 10 years after returning home that Justin realized something was wrong. During an extremely difficult time, in which his stepdaughter was struggling with depression and suicidal ideation, Justin noticed that experiences and memories from Iraq began to surface. His stepdaughter was in and out of treatment facilities at that time, spending time in a hospital setting, and seeing his stepdaughter on a hospital bed triggered images and memories of the young girl on the gurney in that hospital in Tal Afar. He couldn't stop thinking about her. He wondered if anyone was with her when she died. He wished he had stopped to help her. He second-guessed their decision to arrest the shooter and wondered if they had killed him instead. Might the girl still be alive? These are the kinds of thoughts, memories, and images that haunt military veterans. No human being is built to witness death, destruction, and atrocities en masse and keep going. These experiences cause trauma that gets locked into the mind, heart, and even the body. Justin says his wife and mother had noticed changes in him when he returned from Iraq, despite his own assessment that he was doing fine. 10 years later, as the signs of post-traumatic stress began to surface during his stepdaughter's crisis, Justin's wife demanded that he get some help. And that was the beginning of his healing journey. He started with a 5-day retreat for military veterans. This was the first time he realized, or at least the first time he admitted, that he might have PTSD. Next, Justin tried therapy, where he experienced EMDR, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, a technique used to relieve psychological stress. He says EMDR was effective and helped him process the thoughts and emotions that haunted him around the girl on the hospital gurney. Next, he attended another 5-day retreat. This one was for military veterans and first responders. He found the second retreat to be more effective, primarily because the first one had presented brief introductions to some healing modalities like yoga and meditation. But the second one offered a more immersive experience by integrating these new practices into each day. That, he says, enabled him to feel the benefits and improvements by the time he left. This retreat also provided Justin with one of the most important elements of his healing process: community. After returning home from Iraq, Justin felt a deep void and experienced an unexpected grieving period, realizing he would never have the depth of connection, solidarity, and community he had experienced in the Army. He missed his military family. The retreat filled that void by bringing together 10 men with similar backgrounds who bonded, shared, and healed together over the course of the week. Justin left that retreat knowing this was his new community. Their connection, he says, was genuine and authentic, and he knew it would endure. When he left the retreat, he knew he could reach out to any member of this group, or any alumnus or mentor of the program at any time, and he would be supported. The group has stayed connected and continues to support the healing journey of each individual. Tools: mindfulness, community, EMDR therapy. According to Justin, the tools he has found most helpful on his healing journey are mindfulness, community, and EMDR therapy. What needs to change? Justin ticked off a list of changes he believes would improve military and veteran wellness and curtail the epidemic of suicide. Developing resiliency programs prior to deployment. Reducing stigma through peer support programs. Post-enlistment, having a better handoff to veteran community and VSOs, Veterans Service Organizations, so there isn't a lapse in community that leads to isolation, depression, and suicide. Justin currently serves as Executive Director of The Battle Within, thebattlewithin.org, a 5-day healing journey in nature for veterans and first responders, located in Kansas City, Missouri. Brenda. Law enforcement. 28 years. Colonel. Retired as an undersheriff in charge of jail operations. Spent the majority of her career in patrol and investigations. Brenda and I sat down at my kitchen table and visited over lunch. She seems to be doing very well, and I wanted to know how she managed to retire so healthfully after almost 30 years on the job. After lunch, we moved to my couch, and she started to open up about her years in law enforcement. She said as she approached retirement, she realized she had been through a lot. So she decided to try a little therapy, just to make sure everything was okay. She believes that decision played a huge role in her healthy transition from the law enforcement life. Difficult experiences. After about 2 months on the job, Brenda experienced one of the most traumatic and horrific incidents of her career. She was young, enthusiastic, and eager to right the wrongs. She planned to change the world and bring justice to the unjust. While on patrol, she was flagged down by a couple of kids who told her they had heard shots fired on the other side of the parking lot they were in. She was a rookie, so she was excited. She flew to the other side of the parking lot to see what was going on. Brenda says she remembers the next part like it happened yesterday. She picked up her radio and said, "Number 7, be advised I was flagged down by 2 white males who reported shots fired at..." And she gave the location. The dispatcher came back with, "Number 7, be advised we have a report of an officer in trouble at your location." But the dispatcher didn't click off the line like they normally did. She held the line open. Then she said, "Number 7, be advised we have a report of an officer down at your location." And that's the last thing Brenda heard before she got out of the car. As she approached the scene, she saw people huddled around a body on the ground. One man in the huddle turned, and when he did, Brenda could see the victim's pants. They were the same pants she was wearing, and she realized it was someone from the sheriff's office. It was one of her own. He had been killed execution style, a gunshot wound to the head. Brenda was the first deputy on the scene. She was 24 years old. Soon after this incident, Brenda knew she had been through a traumatic event and wanted to make sure she was okay, so she asked for help. Of course, this was back in a time when there weren't resources available for deputies who were dealing with the mental and emotional fallout from the job. So she was sent to the department guy who was in charge of psychiatric evaluations for pre-hires. He conducted a quick interview, and after checking a few things off on some list, he decided she was okay, because she didn't show any of the standard symptoms, like alcoholism. So she was sent on her way. Therefore, she was on her own to deal with it. It took Brenda a long time to process what had happened, and to reconcile that incident in her head and heart. Many years later, she found herself in that parking lot. She got out of her car and sat on the very same window ledge she had sat on that night so many years ago, trying to compose herself after that horrific incident. As she sat there reflecting, somewhere deep inside, she knew she was going to be okay. Later in her career, Brenda was shot at with a 12-gauge shotgun. The shots missed her, hit the window of her car, and sprayed off. After the shooter was apprehended, he kept screaming at her, "I tried to kill you! I tried to kill you, you fucking sheriff!" I'd like to interject here that my mouth was probably hanging open at this point, because I can't imagine what it's like to have a job so dangerous that you could potentially die on any given day. And I can't fathom what it would be like to face down someone who is literally trying to kill you. I've learned that the examples given here, the stories shared, are the rule and not the exception. First responders see, hear, and endure a lot during their careers. My sincerest gratitude to Brenda for sharing her story with us. turning point. As Brenda began to think about her inevitable retirement, she decided to try some therapy and just make sure everything was okay. At a certain point in her ongoing therapy, she had an epiphany. She realized that although she had been meeting with this therapist for quite some time, and she liked her, she hadn't yet allowed herself to fully trust her. She had shared bits and pieces of her story, but not the whole thing. So, over the course of the next month, Brenda sat down and wrote out 12 pages in an outline form of the bigger traumas she had experienced in her life and career. She went all the way back to childhood and listed those traumas chronologically. At her next counseling appointment, she handed the 12 pages to her therapist and said, "This is my story." After looking over the pages, the therapist said, "I need to see you once a week for now." Brenda, who up to this point had only popped in every month or two, agreed to switch to weekly sessions. It took 4 full sessions to go through the 12 pages. By the end of session 2, they had made their way halfway through the list, and Brenda began to dread the 3rd session. Having worked through the first half of her story with the therapist, she remembers thinking, "Maybe I'm too broken to be fixed." At the onset of the 3rd session, Brenda opened by asking her therapist if she had a plan for what to do with all of this. She began to feel the urgent need to make sure that the therapist had a plan to fix this, to fix her. And the question still lingered. Am I too broken to be fixed? When Brenda looked over the 12 pages she had written, she couldn't imagine that somebody could go through all that and not be broken. It turns out she wasn't too broken to be fixed. She wasn't broken at all. But she did need to tell her story. And working through her story with a therapist helped her process all the trauma so she could move forward and eventually retire healthfully. Tools. Therapy. Brenda admits she was terrified to begin therapy. She had avoided it for a long time, and even carried her therapist's card around for 6 months before calling to make that first appointment. But she also says it was the best decision she ever made. For a long time, she kept her therapy appointments a secret, because there was, and still is, a stigma attached to law enforcement officers seeking mental health support. Eventually, people began to find out, and to her surprise, there was acceptance of her choice to go to therapy. Not only that, but her honesty and willingness to be vulnerable and transparent opened the door for others to admit they were in counseling too. She understands why a lot of people, especially in law enforcement, are resistant to trying therapy. The key, she says, is to find the right therapist. And she knows this is what many first responders dread as they begin to ponder the idea of counseling. The chore of shopping around and the dread around telling their story to someone who cannot possibly understand what they've been through. Maybe they feel they don't have the time, or they don't want to take the time to find the right person. Understandably, this process seems tedious and difficult, especially to someone who is dealing with high stress, anxiety, or depression. But this, according to Brenda, is the most important piece. You have to find someone who is a good fit. Meditation and mindfulness. Brenda also cites meditation and mindfulness as crucial tools that help her stay well and balanced. In her words, meditation allows me to become a better best friend to myself more than anything else. It is time spent intensely alone with who I am and who I am in this universe. Mindfulness has taught me to feel, even the benign things, the wind, the cold, etc. What needs to change? Brenda would love to see embedded therapists in each and every law enforcement organization. or at least easy access to therapy. She believes that during annual evaluations, a check-in session with a therapist should be required. She also believes there needs to be much more mental and emotional preparation provided in the academy, and mandatory, ongoing mental and emotional wellness support and training as the career progresses. This would be an expectation, not an option. She referred to this as progressive resilience training. Brenda is a newly retired undersheriff who now runs her own speaking and consulting business, Wayfinder Consulting, LLC. Adam. Fire service, 25 years. Started as a volunteer cadet 2 weeks before his 15th birthday. Worked up through the ranks. I met Adam in 2017 at a conference where I was teaching meditation and mindfulness to first responders. We chatted during breaks, and I immediately identified him as a super decent human being. His passion for life, his wife and daughter, and his work practically oozes from his pores. Adam and I live about 3 hours apart, so we decided to meet on FaceTime. I'm intrigued by this man because he is one of those brutally honest people, but in the best possible way. And he is who he is, unapologetically, all the time. There is absolutely no bullshit with this guy, and I find that refreshing. We talked for over 2.5 hours. Difficult experiences. Adam didn't share a lot of individual stories of traumatic experiences with me. Instead, he talked about the types of calls he found most disturbing and upsetting over the years. He did share one of his earliest memories of a time when he was a cadet, not quite 16 years old, and worked a massive interior fire. This would be a big no-no with any department these days. I simply cannot image a person that age, still a child, really, dealing with that level of intensity, trauma, and devastation. He also spoke eloquently about the emotional toll of being in a leadership role and making decisions on the fly that could potentially get other people injured or killed. There was so much passion and intensity present when Adam spoke about this that I got a little emotional myself. He told me about a time when he made one such decision and sent people into an extremely dangerous situation. Later, when he reflected on how serious the situation had been and the weight of the responsibility to make the call he made, he was overcome with emotion. His sense of responsibility for the lives of others is awe-inspiring. The types of calls that Adam recalled as being especially difficult were infant not breathing calls, SIDS deaths, and anything involving children. He said that when he was younger, he was maybe a little more desensitized and could get into the professional mindset of just doing his job. But once his own daughter was born, these calls became more challenging and very painful. Another difficult aspect of the job, according to Adam, is the fact that nobody ever talks about the things they see and endure, at least not in a helpful or therapeutic way. "Oh, we talk about it," he said, "but it's usually framed by black humor." Black humor is a term I've heard over and over from first responders. The way these cultures have evolved, it's not okay to talk about the actual incident in a meaningful, emotional way. But it is okay to make a joke. While this might seem cold or inhuman to some, it is, in fact, just the opposite, in my opinion. I see it as a human coping mechanism. When a human being witnesses trauma, violence, death, and devastation, but isn't afforded any healthy outlets through which to offload what they've taken in, joking and laughing can serve as a distraction and an emotional release. No human being is built to take on endless trauma and hold on to it. One more thing that Adam talked to me about was the experience of working on a person, trying to save their life. when you know they aren't going to make it. He shared that this really takes an emotional toll and is fairly common in his line of work. This one really made me stop and think, or should I say feel. I have never experienced, nor can I imagine, trying to save a dying human being and then watching them die. When I meet and get to know people like Adam with this level of depth, passion, and insight, I feel a deep sense of appreciation for the people on this planet who are brave enough and strong enough to live their lives in service to others. I am grateful to Adam for his time, his honesty, and for trusting me. Turning point. When I asked Adam if he had experienced a turning point, there was no hesitation. He said, "I realized that I couldn't continue to drink the amount I was drinking and stay married." He went on to tell me that he also realized he wasn't maintaining as well as he thought he was. He would not have considered himself a person with a drinking problem, and he wasn't technically an alcoholic by definition. But he admits that his social drinking was out of control. He was using alcohol as a coping mechanism to numb the emotional pain. Adam took a class called Building Resilience and Surviving Secondary Trauma, taught by Major Darren Ivey of the Kansas City, Missouri Police Department. This class was created by a group of people from KCPD and a group from Truman Medical Center's Behavioral Health Center, also located in Kansas City, Missouri. He credits this class as part of the turning point for him. The 4-hour block of training takes a deep dive into first responder stress, trauma, and suicide, and helped Adam put words to what he was experiencing. The data and information contained in the class helped explain why he felt the way he did. He also learned about the ACE, Adverse Childhood Experiences, test. He took the test and scored very high, meaning he had endured a lot of adverse childhood experiences, which further explained some of the pain and trauma he was carrying. Adam claims emphatically that his turning point saved his marriage. He says it made him a better father and a better man in every way. Prior to this, he admits that he devalued everything else in his life for the job. That's what he believed. He thought that in order to be a good firefighter, the job always came first. Now he prioritizes well-being and family, and he encourages others to do the same. Tools. The principles of Buddhism and mindfulness. Along the way, Adam discovered the principles and philosophies of Buddhism and mindfulness. He learned that getting well was an internal responsibility, and that nothing external was going to help him. This discovery led to introspection, and that changed everything. What needs to change? Adam had a lot to say on this topic, and he made some great points. There needs to be less lip service and more action, he said right off the bat. There needs to be more scientific research on this specific population, this specific culture. And the research needs to be adapted to full-time firefighters versus part-time, and large metropolitan areas versus rural areas. I asked him what prevents the action. The stigma. The stigma around mental illness and mental issues, and the stigma around having anything wrong with us that we cannot handle. Adam also noted the outside world has changed also. We used to be able to use black humor around the kitchen table. Now we are fearful of who will hear and be offended, so we do not share. In addition to the reduction in sharing, he mentioned the diminished bonding time in recent years. Many fire departments have individual bedrooms, so when the day is done, firefighters retreat to their private space. We have lost that traditional family time. These changes have impacted our ability to share what bothered us in a way that was culturally accepted in the fire service. Adam went on to say they need to develop coping programs for recruits, seasoned firefighters, and retirees. The training needs to normalize the aspects of the job that nobody is talking about. I interpreted this as meaning that it needs to address the mental and emotional weight of this profession, not just the critical incidents, in an honest and open way, which will serve to better prepare the recruits, sustain the veterans, and support those who have retired. He added that the training should educate and inform, must be relevant, and should be regularly updated. Adam currently serves his department as Assistant Chief of Training. Nate. Military, law enforcement. U.S. Marine Corps, 11th Marines Counter Battery Radar Platoon. 4 years, 2 combat tours, both in Iraq. Law enforcement, 14 years. Nate and I sat down in one of my favorite coffee shops in downtown Kansas City so I could interview him for this book. We're both involved with a local organization called The Battle Within, which provides a 5-day healing retreat in nature for military veterans and first responders. Several months ago, Nate and his wife attended one of my 4-hour trainings. A few weeks later, he and I met in a barbecue joint to discuss my role with The Battle Within, and I always have the pleasure of seeing him when I teach mindfulness at the retreats. But I first learned of Nate in 2017 when I saw a video clip of him talking about the retreat he had attended that he says saved his life. Nate is a solid person with an impressive career of service to country and community. He's a big, strong-looking dude with a lot of tattoos, but I get the feeling he's a gentle giant. I've seen his goofy dad side on social media, and it's pretty adorable. There is something about this guy that is so likable, and I'm glad to know him. I am grateful to Nate for taking time out of his crazy busy life to have coffee with me and let us into his world. I want to point out that Nate was only 17 years old when he joined the Marines, and he left for boot camp 10 days after turning 18. He was deployed to the Middle East twice, and was among the first American soldiers to be deployed at the very beginning of the war in 2003. And here's an eye-popper for you. During his first deployment, he went 76 days in the desert without a shower. Difficult experiences. Nate's counter-battery radar team was an artillery unit responsible for tracking enemy shells, mortars, etc. Although they were on the front lines, they never had to fight up close until they hit Baghdad. They set up a headquarters, which the Marines call a CMOC, Civilian Military Operations Center, and they stood guard around the Sheraton Hotel located in Baghdad, in the circle where they famously pulled down the statue of Saddam Hussein with a tank. One night, while Nate was on guard duty, he noticed some movement in the street, and it seemed suspicious. He reported this, and his sergeant instructed him to put some rounds on it. Shots started to come back at the Marines, which kicked off a massive engagement. During the gunfights, Nate noticed 2 individuals approaching, flanking their position, and he fired at them, killing them both. This incident, Nate says, impacted him more than anything else he ever experienced or endured. The up-close taking of 2 human lives. He remembers being extremely overwrought and says he could not calm himself down. He was in shock. He was shaken to his core. But instead of offering him some kind of comfort or debrief, his commander pulled him in front of a TV camera. The journalists were from Turkish CNN, and within minutes of that harrowing incident, they were interviewing Nate on camera. He has no memory of the interview. He was in shock, which had to be clear and apparent to anyone around him. But the shock was never addressed in any way, shape, or form. The kill was glorified. That incident created a deep moral conflict in Nate, which he still lives with to this day. Turning point. The turning point for Nate was a retreat for veterans called Warrior's Ascent. There are so many layers to this story that I wish you could hear him tell it yourself. First of all, he did not want to go, and he was pissed off to be there. He said a friend of his rode him like a pony until he finally agreed to go, mostly to shut the guy up. Nate says he always knew he had post-traumatic stress, but he didn't know it was affecting his life. He thought it was just something he had to deal with. He says, I was angry. I was always angry. I was cold. He says he considered being hard to be a good thing. He didn't feel things. He didn't cry when he was sad. Admittedly, he was locked up inside. So there was nothing about this retreat that appealed to him. He thought it was hippie bullshit, and he simply did not think he needed it. But surprisingly, once there, he changed his opinion pretty quickly and began to think there might be something in it for him after all. One of his most profound moments came toward the end of the retreat. There is a ceremony in the woods that all the attendees participate in, and he was helping clean up afterward. He grabbed a water cooler and started carrying it to one of the cars. As he emerged from the woods, he says he looked around, and he could see colors that he felt like he'd never seen before. The wind felt different on his skin. The clouds looked crisper in the sky. He stopped and wondered, what the hell is this? He didn't know what was happening. He brought this up with one of the counselors later, who told him, you've literally suppressed your emotions and feelings for so long that your body has suppressed your physical senses. Nate calls that realization his big, holy crap moment. He realized this was truly a new beginning for him. He says without that retreat, he would not be married, and it helped him become a much better dad. Tools. Meditation. Nate cited meditation as the #1 tool that helped him heal and continues to help him on his healing path. He has meditated nearly every day for 5 years now. He told me, it helps me slow the busy me down so I can observe the problem instead of being in the problem. As a side note, Nate added that he was born with a stutter, and meditation has helped his stutter tremendously. He notices that when he skips meditation, the stutter gets worse. Therapy. Therapy is another important tool that helped Nate. He initially tried therapy in several different ways, and he also tried medications. That path, he said, was even more traumatizing because he couldn't find the right therapist, and it felt like nothing was working. After the retreat, he was finally able to find a therapist with whom he could connect. That's when therapy began to help. Community. Nate says community is an important element of healing for him, and his community helps him maintain his growth. And, he says, developing the ability to be vulnerable has also been a key component to his well-being. What needs to change? When I asked Nate this question, right off the bat he said, the whole John Wayne thing needs to die. It made good movies, but it's not real. He went on to say that nobody should ever be shamed for admitting that something's wrong and they're trying to work through it. He added that in the military and in law enforcement, it is frowned upon to ask for help, and that has to stop. Also, in his experience, there needs to be better integration of the business side and the personal side of military and law enforcement operations. Nate currently serves as a police officer with the Metropolitan Police Department and is the program director for the Battle Within, Kansas City. Dawn. Dispatch, 25 years. Served as a clerk, a call taker, a dispatcher, and a dispatch supervisor. I first met Dawn in 2017 when she attended one of my classes at a local mental health center. She introduced herself, and we chatted about how much meditation and mindfulness could help call takers and dispatchers. Then, in January of 2019, Dawn attended my Train the Trainer class to learn more about teaching Learn to Pause mindfulness training and Pause 15 meditation. Dawn is a fierce advocate for dispatchers and a big believer that meditation and mindfulness instruction should be offered to all telecommunicators. I have so much respect for this strong, compassionate woman, and I just really like her. She has endured a tremendous amount of trauma in her life, both personally and professionally. I'd like to allow Dawn to tell you about that in her own words. Difficult experiences. As a supervisor, it is my job to listen to and make copies of 911 calls and dispatch air traffic for any critical incident. I have heard shots being fired at officers. I've listened as an officer's radio mic was stuck because he was being dragged down the highway by a vehicle driven by a drunk driver. I've listened as an officer was screaming because he couldn't find his partner who had been hit by a car while throwing out stop sticks. I have listened to people being raped and parents who have woken up after rolling over on their infant who is no longer breathing. I have experienced schizophrenic people changing personalities over the phone. I have listened to people begging us to find them, even though they had no idea where they were. And some of those people ended up dying because we couldn't find them. I have listened to people scream for help because their loved one was shot. And I've listened as that loved one took their last breath. As I reread Dawn's words, I am shocked and saddened by what these brave professionals endure. I'd like to interject here and share that I visited Dawn a few months ago at the dispatch center where she has worked for 25 years. She gave me a tour of the call taker side and the dispatch side of operations. Then she and I took a seat next to one of the dispatchers so I could observe. Within minutes, a call came in that I will never forget. When I got home, I wrote the following recap on my Pause First Project Facebook page. March 30th, 2019. I recently visited a large metropolitan dispatch center. I was blown away by all the activity and the skill and professionalism of the dispatchers. They graciously showed me around and described the process of taking calls and dispatching officers. And then a call came in that I will never forget. Motionless, I observed as this call unfolded. At first, I could only hear the dispatcher side of the conversation. Suicide attempt. 14-year-old boy, gunshot wound to the head. Caller attempting CPR. Then a supervisor made the call audible, and I could hear the caller, the boy's mother. The desperate screams of a mother trying to save her child hit my ears like a lightning bolt, and I began to cry. I had to leave the room. I was shaken to my core, and I cry as I relive and recount this event. I could write an entire book about the experience. But here's the crux of what I wish to convey. 1. Dispatchers are first responders. 2. I am deeply grateful to all emergency responders. They see, hear, and endure untold tragedy on a daily basis. 3. I will continue to work hard to raise awareness about first responder stress, trauma, secondary trauma, and suicide. 4. As a society, we need to do a much better job of caring for our first responders. They are traumatized. What in the world would we do without these brave people? Who would protect, save, and rescue us? They run toward danger and devastation while the rest of us are running away. There's one more thing I'd like you to consider about the dispatcher who took this call. Unlike me, she couldn't cry. She couldn't walk out. She can't walk away. Why? Because as the officers and emergency medical techs arrive on the scene, there's another call coming in, and she has to take it. Side note. Sadly, in most states, dispatchers are not classified as first responders. They are classified as clerical. In Dawn's words, call takers and dispatchers are the first responders. Now, bearing in mind Dawn's professional stress and trauma, let's continue by hearing from her what she has experienced personally. In 2016, after a 4-year battle with drug addiction and mental illness, my 23-year-old daughter committed suicide. I happened to be the one to find her. She also used my weapon to complete the suicide. I had to be the one to tell my 15-year-old twin sons their sister had died. This absolutely turned my world upside down. Since then, in February of 2019, I also lost my brother-in-law to suicide. He was an undercover police officer at the time. I was with my sister when she found out. She is now a single mother of 3 boys, one of whom is the son of the police officer. Currently, one of my sons is working through his own depression and anxiety as a result of these traumas in our personal life. I want to thank Dawn for her raw vulnerability and for letting us into her world. Her story helps highlight the fact that first responders who deal with indescribable stress and trauma at work every day also experience stress and trauma in their personal lives, just like the rest of us. As a society, we need to raise awareness of this fact and proactively find ways to help and support these fine people. Turning point. Dawn shared that her turning point occurred in 2017. While she was working, a call came in reporting that a female had jumped off a bridge into the Missouri River. Officers were dispatched and were able to rescue the woman and take her to the hospital for treatment. A few hours later, dispatch received a call from a man who said he had just returned home from work and found that his 8-year-old son had been drowned in the bathtub. It turned out these 2 calls were related. The woman who had jumped from the bridge earlier was the mother of this boy, and she was the one who had drowned him. Remember, in the previous year, Dawn had lost her daughter to suicide. What you don't know is that Dawn found her daughter in the bathtub, having completed suicide. So the incident with the mother and the boy and the bathtub, understandably, triggered a tremendous amount of trauma for Dawn. After this incident, Dawn decided to attend the West Coast Post-Trauma Retreat, WCPR, a program designed for first responders whose lives have been affected by their work experience. Tools. Dawn found the West Coast Post-Trauma Retreat to be very helpful. She says it was comforting to know that she wasn't being judged for what she was going through, and she felt supported by everyone there. EMDR. One of the most impactful experiences during the WCPR, according to Dawn, was EMDR therapy. EMDR stands for Eye Movement Desensitization and Reprocessing. Dawn says, prior to EMDR, the memory of finding my daughter was very vivid. The colors were vivid. The scene was very large and seemed very close to me. After EMDR, there was a complete change. The mental image, the picture, seemed far away and small. It was softened, like it had a cloud over it. EMDR is proving to be an effective treatment for first responders who are dealing with post-traumatic stress symptoms and or a diagnosis of PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. Meditation and breathing techniques. Dawn also cites meditation and breathing as important tools she uses every day. She says, when I feel myself getting stressed or worked up, I stop what I'm doing and take a short break to breathe. Deep breaths do wonders to get me back on track. coloring. Believe it or not, Dawn has found coloring to be extremely relaxing, and it is a tool she says she uses almost every night before going to bed. Therapy. Dawn also included therapy in the list of tools she has found helpful on her healing path. She says she sees a therapist regularly. What needs to change? According to Dawn, first and foremost, we must let first responders know it's okay to not be okay. She says the suck-it-up, buttercup days need to end because human beings are not built to see, hear, and endure the things that first responders encounter on a daily basis. Here are a few more of Dawn's suggestions. Have resources available to first responders when they need someone to talk to, and this must be someone they can trust. Create peer support teams. Have therapists available to work with first responders in crisis, and ensure that these therapists specialize in treating first responders. Dawn currently serves as a dispatch supervisor for a metropolitan police department. She co-facilitates CIT, Crisis Intervention Training, for telecommunicators. She has participated in the WCPR retreat in a peer support role. She is part of a roving peer support team for call takers and dispatchers. And she is on the advisory committee and is a team leader for her department's peer support team. John. Law enforcement, 20 years. Police officer, police sergeant. John and I met in 2017 after a mindfulness presentation I delivered at a local police academy. He introduced himself and told me the short version of his story, and we talked for a long time as we packed up and walked to our cars. He's so darn easy to talk to. John has an authenticity and sweetness about him that is magnetic. When you meet him, you want to be his friend. We've stayed in touch, and we've seen each other here and there in the past 2 years. I knew as I started to formulate ideas for this book that I wanted to interview John. Difficult experiences. When John was 17 years old, his big brother committed suicide. The brothers were only 15 months apart in age. We were best friends, John told me. That was a devastating loss. I can attest to the fact that there is no loss like suicide. It leaves a massive hole. I'm not saying it's worse than other losses, just different. Suicide is unique because it is incredibly difficult to live with the fact that a person you loved was in so much pain that they did not want to live. In a way, suicide passes that pain on to survivors. Next, John told me about another devastating blow. 2.5 years into policing, a good friend of his, a fellow officer who had been on the job a very long time, died in a line-of-duty shooting. John says this officer was a veteran when John was new to the job, and he was the only old-timer who had talked to him in his rookie days. In some ways, John recalls, the older officer felt fatherly. His death hit hard. Aside from the day-to-day stress and trauma that police officers encounter on the job, such as violent individuals, intoxicated people who want to fight, drug overdoses, brutal domestic violence, and crimes against children, most of them are also suffering with invisible wounds and pain, like John was. John now realizes he was carrying unprocessed trauma that reached back into his childhood and continued to pile up throughout his adulthood and career. Turning point. What John shared with me about his turning point is both heartbreaking and inspirational. As you know, my husband's suicide was the catalyst for the work I'm doing now. And I'm sure you're also aware that law enforcement suicide is epidemic and getting worse. This story, from a veteran cop who wanted to die, came very close to dying, but ultimately survived and is thriving, encapsulates the entire purpose of this book. I am so grateful to John for his vulnerability. John shared that just a few years ago, he was sitting in his truck in a parking lot, ugly crying, and trying to muster the courage to put his gun in his mouth and pull the trigger. He had made the decision to take his own life. He had a plan, and he was prepared to execute that plan. His phone on the seat next to him had been ringing and ringing, but he was ignoring it. Then, all of a sudden, he got a text, and for some reason, he decided to look at it. It was a supportive text from a friend, and something about that text sort of snapped him out of it, as he recalls. 2 weeks later, knowing he was in desperate need of support, John attended a 5-day retreat in nature, which was designed for military veterans and first responders. That retreat changed John's life forever. I want to take a moment and reflect on how close John came to dying by his own hand. He was so traumatized, unhappy, and hopeless that he believed death was the only way to escape the pain. If this resonates with you even a little, please know this. John's life looks nothing like it did just a couple of years ago. He is happy. He is fulfilled. He has love in his life. He takes good care of himself. He is a better dad. And he is leading, mentoring, and teaching others. If you feel none of this is possible for you, please understand that John once felt none of it was possible for him either. But he didn't pull that trigger. He reached out for help, and he rebuilt himself from the inside out. Today, John is truly happy. Believe me, I've known him for 2 years now, and we spent a very long time catching up in that coffee shop. The dude is living his best life. Tools. Meditation. John says his number one wellness tool, hands down, is meditation. He learned how to meditate at the retreat he attended, and he began to use meditation to help him identify and control his responses to the emotions he was feeling. John continues to meditate. In fact, he recently hit an important goal. John meditated every single day without exception for 365 days. 1 year of meditation, no missed days. That's pretty impressive. He says meditation has made him much more mindful in his life. Therapy. John says therapy has been a lifesaver for him, but he cautions others, you've got to find the right therapist, and you have to open up, or it won't help. What needs to change? John says we have to make it okay for police officers and other first responders to show their emotions in a healthy way. He says the law enforcement culture has done a lot of harm by teaching people to be non-emotional. In his opinion, there is strength in showing emotion in the proper way at the proper time. Also, he's adamant that asking for help must become acceptable because, he says, people are masking and numbing their pain with alcohol, prescription drugs, and sex. According to John, cops are trained to suggest that people seek professional help for mental and emotional struggles, but they don't take their own advice. He thinks recruits need to understand how bad things will be, and they must be encouraged to make themselves a priority. You can't devote your life to helping everyone but yourself, John says. He also believes that recruits in the academy need to be told the truth about the job in a more direct way. He says they need to hear things like, you're going to see the worst of humanity. Friends are going to die. You will be in danger regularly. Then, John says, veteran cops should come in and tell their stories to emphasize these realities. John also feels mental and emotional training should be integrated into the academy to better prepare recruits for what they will witness and endure. John is currently a police sergeant with the Metropolitan Police Department. Wendy. Law enforcement, 22 years. Special Agent INS, now DHS, Department of Homeland Security. Police officer, detective. Substance abuse coordinator, Sheriff's Department. Wendy and I met in 2017 at a CIT, Crisis Intervention Team meeting, where I was teaching mindfulness. We had an instant connection, primarily because she is so dang easy to like. After that meeting, we stayed in touch and have become friends, even though we live 3 hours apart. The more I learn about Wendy's life path and career, the more impressed I am. Difficult experiences. In Wendy's career, she has primarily worked crimes against persons, including homicide, gangs, domestic violence, and sex crimes. Wendy started this conversation by sharing that in her early days as a police officer working third shift, she encountered a lot of difficulty with male co-workers. I'm so glad she brought this up because it's prevalent among female law enforcement, and like everything else we're addressing in this book, needs to be brought to light. The men, she says, treated her very poorly, and that added a tremendous amount of unnecessary stress to an already stressful job. Another crucially important aspect Wendy cited was balancing motherhood and her career. Both of her daughters were born prematurely, which adds mightily to the stressors of parenthood. She remembers one day in particular getting a call at work that her infant daughter was sick and needed to be picked up immediately. Wendy's husband, also law enforcement, was not available, and although Wendy was extremely busy at work, she had to leave. Driving home that day with her infant daughter in tow, the intense stress of the situation got the best of Wendy, and she had a panic attack, something she had never experienced before. The panic attack was so intense, she says, that she could barely breathe and had to pull the car over. Something else Wendy addressed, which nobody else in this book mentioned, is organizational stress. In my many interactions and private conversations with first responders over the years, I can attest to the fact that this is a primary stressor. People often share with me that bosses, supervisors, outdated policies, power struggles, and bureaucracy contribute hugely to their stress. On top of all this, remember, there is the day-to-day stress and trauma of police work. Early in Wendy's career, she worked with a domestic violence victim who was later killed by the perpetrator who had abused her. After trying to help this victim and getting to know her and her story, the woman's death hit Wendy very hard. At another point in Wendy's career, she worked in a serial rapist case that, for her as a woman, was extremely difficult. Another tough case that really hit home involved a little girl whose mother had been killed by her boyfriend. The girl was the one who found her mother, shot in the head. This was a gut-wrenching interview because at the time, Wendy's own daughter was the same age as the little girl. As the girl described what she'd experienced, Wendy says she had to fight hard to hold back her own emotions. She remembers going home, hugging her daughter, and then talking to her husband about what had happened. I'm going to interject here with an observation. I believe the last few words of that last sentence are critical. She talked to her husband about what had happened. I have discovered that this is a missing component for nearly every first responder. They are traumatized. They have endured horrors most of us can't imagine, but they don't talk about any of it. This culture of silent suffering has got to change. Talking about one's stress, trauma, and experiences is an important step to processing and healing from the exposure to them. Nobody is built to take on years of trauma and hold it in. Turning point. Wendy says, looking back, even though she loved her job and was happy at home, she was drowning in guilt. When she was at work, she felt she should be at home. When she was at home, she felt she should be working. She realizes in hindsight that she existed in a constant state of fight or flight, and she didn't sleep well for over a decade. At the age of 41, Wendy tried yoga for the first time, primarily as a way to lose residual baby weight. Unexpectedly, she says she noticed that she started to feel better overall. She felt calmer and more patient, even when she wasn't doing yoga. She admits yoga was not an instant fix, but it was the first step on her path to healing. Tools. Yoga. Wendy's number one wellness tool is yoga. It's my go-to physical activity that allows me to incorporate breathing and mindfulness, she says. Wendy is a 200-hour RYT, registered yoga teacher, and a YFFR, Yoga for First Responders, ambassador. Breathwork. Breathwork is my go-to because it's accessible anywhere, anytime. Meditation. Since I started to meditate regularly about 2 years ago, I have fine-tuned my self-awareness. Allowing myself to sit with discomfort and learning to recognize my triggers have been very helpful in all aspects of my life. Therapy. Wendy also listed therapy as one of her wellness tools. Talking to friends. There was a time when Wendy kept everything very close and only talked to her husband about her experiences. Now she calls talking to friends her version of peer support. Once she was firmly planted on a healing path, she began opening up and discussing things with trusted friends. She says having a good, solid support system is extremely helpful. What needs to change? Wendy is a firm believer that we must begin to normalize the conversation regarding issues that law enforcement officers and other first responders face. She feels that every department should have a comprehensive wellness program to include peer support, family support, resilience training, mindfulness, emotional intelligence, and embedded psychologists. She points out that in 2017, Congress passed the LEMHWA, Law Enforcement Mental Health and Wellness Act, which offers grant funding for peer support, resilience training, and more. She believes recognition of the importance of these issues at the federal level is necessary, and that it will trickle down to local government. In Wendy's own experience, introducing yoga to her department and initiating a conversation about wellness and mindfulness has been impactful. She's noticed a significant shift in mindset. She admits that introducing yoga into the law enforcement culture was not easy, and there was a lot of pushback in the beginning. But that has improved immensely. She says she admires the leadership at the time for allowing the implementation of the yoga program, which they offered internally, and also taught to recruits. In terms of what needs to change, this example points to leadership. The people at the top have to begin embracing new approaches to wellness. Officer mental and emotional well-being must be prioritized, and the culture must evolve into one of balance and holistic care for the men and women who wear the uniform and all who surround and support them. Wendy now serves as the substance abuse coordinator for her local sheriff's department. Myron. Law enforcement, 16 years. Police officer, police sergeant. This guy. Oh, my goodness. Myron. Spelled M-Y-R-O-N-E. A one-of-a-kind spelling for a one-of-a-kind man. I've gotten to know Myron over the past couple of years, and I consider him a friend. He's realer than real. He is who he is, unapologetically. He's a thinker. He studies life and lives fully. He's just a solid human being. Myron came to one of my classes back in 2017. He spoke up in class and talked to the group about his struggles with anxiety and how he came to find meditation. He was funny. He's a storyteller. But he was also genuine, and he piqued my curiosity. I was impressed with the way he opened up and shared so easily. This, I can assure you, is not the norm in my first responder classes. Several months later, Myron allowed me to visit him at work and interview him on video about his experiences with job stress and anxiety, and his thoughts about meditation for first responders. Then, in January of this year, he attended my Train the Trainer class. We stayed in touch and were connected on social media, and that's where I really see him shine. Myron likes to stir the pot and make people think and feel. He's not really a shit starter. He's more of a conversation starter. One thing I greatly admire about Myron is his dedication to family. He is laser-focused on being the best version of himself, and he's committed to being a good man, husband, and father. He realizes this takes effort, so he works on himself to help keep the family unit strong. This, to me, is epic. Difficult experiences. Myron shared an experience that occurred early in his career, which made him realize for the first time, in a very real way, that his job is dangerous. He was on duty in a patrol car, like so many nights before, when a call went out about a house fire. He and another officer drove toward the address to see how they might be able to assist. As he approached the street, he could see a massive neighborhood fire blazing, something he had never seen before. He parked his car and ran toward the scene. The fire, he recalls, had engulfed the entire house, and as he approached, he could feel the intense heat radiating. Bystanders on scene indicated that people were trapped in the back of the house, so Myron ran to the back. He broke down the back door and found an elderly man just inside the doorway. The man was holding an infant and had been trying to get out, but the heat, flames, and black smoke had prevented him from exiting. Myron grabbed the baby girl from the man's arms and handed her off to someone, then began performing CPR on the older gentleman. As he tried to save the man, he realized he was dangerously close to the fire and needed to move away. He picked the man up and ran with him to a safer distance and continued to try to revive him. He was finally able to carry the man to an ambulance parked down the street. Unfortunately, the man did not survive. In fact, 5 people died that night. The elderly man, his infant granddaughter, and 3 other grandchildren. Myron was taken to the hospital and treated for smoke inhalation. He says he was very shaken up as the reality of the dangerous nature of his job began to sink in. At the time, 2 of his children were the same ages as 2 of the children who died. That was something that hit him hard. In my experience with first responders, this is a common experience. Working calls that involve children the same age as, or with similarities to, their own children. Many have shared with me how emotionally wrenching this is, and how it creates fear and hypervigilance in them. They can't stop thinking, that could have been my child. As Myron recounts this story, he says, I can still remember it like it was yesterday. I can feel the heat, smell the smoke. He says he never spoke with a chaplain. There was no EAP, Employee Assistance Program, and he did not seek help to process the experience. He just powered on, because that's what he believed he was supposed to do. Turning point. Around the time Myron got promoted to sergeant, he also found out he and his wife were expecting their 3rd child, and his mother passed away. He says he also encountered a whole bunch of other life and job stuff, all at the same time. And for the first time in his life, Myron began to experience the uncomfortable and sometimes debilitating symptoms of anxiety. He shared with me that the anxiety got so bad he was struggling to function normally, and he literally felt like he was dying. But, he said, nobody knew. I was really good at hiding it, and I could always work. When I asked him how bad things got, he said, I never actually thought about suicide, but I did occasionally think the world might be better off without me, and I would wonder what it would be like if I just died. It was a marriage issue that motivated Myron to try therapy during this time, and that decision turned out to be his turning point. Talking to the therapist led him to open up about job stress, and for the first time, with the help of the therapist, he realized he had PTSD. He gained awareness through therapy that job-related stress, combined with adverse childhood experiences, caused the PTSD, and he faced the fact that it was all catching up with him. The therapist helped him work through these issues and offered tools, including meditation, to help him navigate the anxiety. This was his real breakthrough, he says, learning how to meditate and committing to a meditation practice. Tools. Myron quickly ticked off a short, definite list when I asked him about the tools he uses to stay healthy and balanced. Self-care, working out, eating a decently healthy diet, and meditation. What needs to change? He was also very definite with his answers to this question. It took him no time at all to shoot back, cops need to stop hiding behind their badge. They need to be real. He went on to say, we think we have all the answers. We have the solutions for everyone else, but we won't apply those solutions to ourselves. I asked him what he would say to an officer on the fence, someone who is struggling but hasn't reached out for help. His answer was direct. You are responsible for your own well-being. Myron believes the onus is on the individual, and they must take the scary steps and do the hard work to get well and healthy for themselves and for their families and the people they love. Myron, thank you for your open honesty and for being a positive role model for others. You're a good dude. Myron currently serves as a police sergeant for a Metropolitan Police Department.